You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, news and gossip, with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today we're talking everything Marlon Brando. And now, here's Julian, Arthur, and Steve.
Thanks, Mike. I thought we could start off by offering a little commentary on this year's Academy Awards. I got to tell you, and we'll talk about different aspects of the show, but the In Memoriam segment was so awful and so horrible that director should have been fired on the spot. You know, the point of the whole In Memoriam segment is to pay tribute and honor those who have passed in the past year. The fact that they were focusing on the dancers and not on the images on the screen, the home audience, I don't know what it was like in the theater, but in the home audience, I couldn't see those names.
You couldn't see the names. You had no idea why people were dancing and singing. And most importantly, as you said, Steve, the idea is to really kind of honor those who have gone and also surprise us in a way, because sometimes we don't even know who they are. But this was the biggest surprise because we had no idea anyone was on that screen. I've never seen a worse idea for anything on major television show.
And my add to what you're saying here is that the In Memoriam was just the worst part of a mostly really bad show, a lot of which was cringeworthy.
Let's get to Marlon, guys.
Well, what a subject. I mean, Brando, come on, guys. I mean, people have written many books on Marlon Brando. I don't know if he wrote, Julian, did he write an autobiography?
No, I don't believe he did.
Right. Julian, what was the first Brando movie you ever saw?
The first Brando movie I saw was On the Waterfront. I was 12 years old, and it was a watershed for me for two reasons. Number one, I had never gone to a movie alone. All my friends had seen the movie, and for some reason I hadn't. And so I went for the first time alone to a movie. And then secondly, the director of the movie, years later, became my mentor, Elia Kazan. So I have a real reason to remember that moment, Steve, very, very, very fondly, to see a movie that I had never seen anything like it up until that point. And years later, when I finally caught up to see A Streetcar Named Desire, that is one of the greatest performances I've ever seen on screen that Brando gives in A Streetcar. But anyhow, that was my first one. How about you, Arth? When was your first Brando?
I saw his first film, The Men, not knowing what I was going to see. I was a kid, but it was great. And I knew it was great even as a kid. There was something great about the movie. Remarkable in my thinking regarding Brando is I didn't really quite get until I did a little research that before he did On the Waterfront, he already did The Men, Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, Julius Caesar, The Wild One, and then On the Waterfront. Now, you know, I just didn't remember that. I saw Viva Zapata. I saw Streetcar Named Desire again as a kid. You look at that and say, what is that? You know, it made no sense. But I did know, watching this guy, that he was special. And he probably, I would say, is as great a presence on the screen as any actor that has ever lived. Would anybody disagree with that? At his top of his game, he had to be as good as it gets.
He had the most talent and the worst choices for films ever. I mean, if you look at his batting average, he had some magnificent performances on some hit films, but he had a run there, particularly in the 60s, where he made one bomb after another. Somebody needed to be really guiding him. There are so many stories about...
It was called Money, Steve. It was called Money.
money,
was just
and I
making,
think
yeah.
that there's a lot of talk that he squandered his talent. Now, the person that he's often compared to when describing the greatest actor of all time is Olivier. Olivier was a theater-oriented actor, spent a lot of time on the stage. Whenever he would burn out, he would go back to the stage. And after Brando left the stage to be a movie actor, he never went back. And it's a feeling that he squandered his talent. Now, the thing I really found interesting in learning a little bit more about him was how much he got from Stella Adler. His training for being an actor was probably the most intensive training ever given an actor. I mean, this guy really dove into it. And he was the Einstein of acting in a way. And I think
she has a famous quote, Steve, that she said about Brando before that anyone knew him. She said, "One day, this puppy thing will become America's greatest actor." That's how smart Stella Adler was regarding this man's talent. While he was studying with her, I like this puppy thing.
A great thing about Brando is that it's similar to great sports stars. Why was Willie Mays the greatest baseball player? Not only was he so great, he had the added element of charisma. He had that special jazz. Likewise, Tiger Woods, sports stars, that extra element of charisma. So one could say, well, Laurence Olivier was really as good or a better actor than Brando, but I'd say, yeah, maybe. But Brando had charisma. He had jazz. He got on the screen and you open your fucking eyes and what the hell is that? He was that great. That when you have that extra quality, you become a superstar. And he was a superstar doing dramatic things.
He had something internally that we'd never seen before. I recently watched Streetcar Named Desire because it was a movie that just flew past me in the 50s. I was too much into science fiction in those days to be taken to see that. But the word smoldering kind of applies to Brando. Whenever he walked on screen, there's a lot going on in his performance. I mean, I'm not a student of the whole acting, the way things have originated from the 20s through silence, but actors came in and said their lines. That's what actors do. I mean, they're given a script and they say their lines. Brando just didn't do that. He came on and he became that character, and he didn't have to say much. His movement, the way his body just interacted with things around him. I mean, in Streetcar Named Desire, it's a very measured performance. It's not like he has a ton of dialogue, but his battle between him and Blanche Dubois, I think it's his sister-in-law. Is that the relationship?
Yeah.
Is just there's so much going on.
But he had the extra dimension.
Yes.
It happens to people. Einstein had an extra dimension. People have that.
It's not to take away anything from him. He was extraordinary in Streetcar, but remember, he did it for over a year on Broadway. He knew that role inside and out.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the first choice. He was Kazan's first choice, but Irene Selznick was the producer at that point, and she wanted John Garfield. And Kazan liked Garfield. They were good friends, so they gave it to Garfield. And Garfield said, hey, it's Blanche Dubois' movie. It's not my movie. I'm second to this character. And if you read the script, and I have, you'll see that it is Blanche Dubois. But Mr. Marlon Brando came in and surprised even Kazan and Tennessee Williams by taking over that play. Just took it over. And the thing, Steve, you talked about acting. We know that people have to memorize lines. That's what an actor has to do. But what Brando made you feel was that it was spontaneous.
Yes.
That it was happening. That it wasn't just he had memorized something. He was living it. This is extraordinary when you see a man with such instinct ability to make you feel it's happening right then as you are watching. Mike Nichols told me of all the shows he ever saw and ever was involved with, he never saw anything like the second night he was at Streetcar Named Desire. He said it was like nothing he had ever seen. And as you said, Steve, and I know Arthur feels that way, I'm sure Mike does too, when you see Streetcar Named Desire, you can't compare that to anything you've ever seen. That performance is like unbelievable. And yes, he was that.
A funny thing, Julian, a dear friend of mine saw Streetcar Named Desire, got so caught up in it. He went out and he and his wife bought a puppy dog, and they called it Stella. So every time he got into the backyard, he'd scream out, "Stella!" He would do Brando, and the little dog would come running.
Well, to go off with Stella for a minute, on one of the Seinfeld shows, they're down in Florida, and Elaine is having trouble sleeping, and they give her the pills, and they go to a dinner, and they introduce her to Seinfeld's parents' close friend, Stella, and she's so bombed, she keeps screaming, "Stella! Stella!" One of the funniest Seinfelds I've ever seen. But I think about Brando, you got to remember that he squandered his career. He did. And he did it on the fact that he didn't have much feeling about what the acting profession was. He wasn't really enamored of being an actor. He fathered many children, many ex-wives, so he had to make these terrible movies that you talked about. But anybody who could make Streetcar and, Waterfront and Viva Zapata and
but Julian,
doesn't get better than that.
Here's what, guys. He made some bad movies after he gained tremendous success. He was getting paid a lot of money to do them. Some of them, by the way, made money. I checked these out. He was more or less profitable, believe me. But here the guy makes The Men in 1950, and he makes Waterfront in 54, and these movies start happening, whatever they may be. There was a Desiree, which happened to be profitable, $1.8 million cost, $9 million it took in. Okay, so he makes these movies, good, bad, and different, and then all of a sudden, 20 years later, he does The Godfather, and there's nothing like it. So in between, he was making good movies, bad movies, whatever. And right after The Godfather, you get to look at a movie called The Last Tango in Paris. Come on. He was incredible in Last Tango in Paris. So you have these little bookends, and then he goes on and he makes a movie called The Formula. I happen to like The Formula, George C. Scott and Brando. Then he makes Apocalypse Now in 1979, which kills him. Big business. You guys are aware of the fact this thing did $130 million.
I want to go back, but before I go back, I have to say Apocalypse Now. All I remember about Marlon Brando in Apocalypse Now is mumbling. He's sitting there in the dark, he's sweating, and he's mumbling. And he's mumbling some more. And they lauded his performance. And I said, what performance? He's mumbling. He doesn't say a complete sentence. I mean, Apocalypse Now is obviously an iconic movie, and there are many, many amazing things in that movie. To me, Marlon Brando was not the plus on that movie, but please disagree with me here.
Let me clarify something.
Not only don't I disagree with you, I 100% agree with you.
Yes.
And couldn't get over the fact that Dennis Hopper kept saying, "Man, will you meet Kurtz? Will you meet Colonel Kurtz? Oh, man, will you meet Colonel Kurtz?" I couldn't wait to meet Colonel Kurtz until I met him. And that was Brando. In the dark, terrible, awful, worst part of the movie.
Yeah, and he looked so silly. He looked so ridiculous and sounded so ridiculous. But as far as business is concerned, to clarify, Apocalypse Now was made for $31 million, a lot of money for 1979, and it grossed $104 million. So whatever, it was a financial success. Here's to Francis Ford Coppola again. But Brando's career is a strange career, but in between these things at the beginning and in the middle and then towards the end, there's these incredible performances. So it's kind of like when he came to bat, every now and then he'd hit a bunt or he'd hit a fly out, and then all of a sudden he hit a grand slam home run.
I have to talk about the first time I saw Marlon Brando, because I missed a lot of his 50s films. I wasn't going to the movies yet. The first movie I really remember seeing Marlon Brando in was The Young Lions, where he played a German, not a Nazi. He played Christian Diestel, who was a German lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, and he's totally blonde with that clipped German accent of his. I thought he was incredible and a very, very powerful movie. In fact, when I was researching my book, Combat Films, American Realism, I went to Switzerland and I met Irwin Shaw, who wrote the original novel. Very unique interview, by the way. This is the first time this ever happened to me. He refused to allow me to take notes or record the interview. So I had to sit there and just remember everything he told me. And he, The Young Lions was very much based on, at least the stuff that takes place in the States, on his life. I mean, he went down to, he's kind of the Montgomery Clift character who goes down to a Southern Army base and gets brutalized by the guys because he's a Jew. But in rereading the novel, The Young Lions, or reading the novel for the first time, they really softened the character from what Brando brought in. Brando had...
Who directed it, Steve? Who was the director?
Edward
Eddie
Dmytryk.
Dmytryk.
Yeah, who had, I think Julian had just come out of the Blacklist period.
Yes.
He was,
yes.
If you read The Young Lions, which is basically, for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a story of three men: Montgomery Clift, a young Jewish man who joins the army. He's actually drafted. Dean Martin plays a Broadway performer, also gets drafted. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, you've got Christian Diestel, a young idealistic German lieutenant who begins to realize that the German war machine is also dominated by the Nazis, epitomized by Maximilian Schell's Captain Hardenberg. But they softened the character a little bit, quite a bit. And it's an amazing film.
Yeah, I have a question for Julian or Steve or Mike. Somehow I missed a movie called The Missouri Breaks. Did you see it? And if you did, what did you think of it?
I did see it. It was a fascinating story as far as how it got made. Elliot Kastner was the producer, and he knew that Brando and Nicholson knew each other. They lived pretty close to each other. And he told Brando that he had Nicholson, and he told Nicholson that he had Brando. And that's
Elliot
how
Kastner.
he ended up getting them both. Arthur Penn directed it, and I think we would be kind to say it was an ill-fated production. I'm afraid there's a lot of those in Marlon Brando's life, but as we've pointed out, he made some great, great movies.
Was it Brando's fault, do you think, or was it the movie or the script?
I think it was the script, partially, and I think it was just not good. It wasn't good. I mean, we haven't talked about Marlon Brando's one foray into directing, and that was One-Eyed Jacks. And One-Eyed Jacks has a history that I was shocked to read. Do you know who the original director was of One-Eyed Jacks?
Stanley Kubrick.
That's right. Isn't that something, Arthur?
Yes.
Kubrick was the original director. The original writer, do you know that, Steve?
I don't.
Rod Serling was the original writer.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Then they brought in Sam Peckinpah, and he wrote a script. Then with Kubrick, because he had this wonderful success of Paths of Glory, he gets Calder Willingham to come in. And all of these people are coming in and rewriting under Brando's company, because Brando is not only starring, he's producing in it. 2 weeks before principal photography. Now think of that. 2 weeks before, Stanley Kubrick either gets fired or quits. My belief, he quit. He wanted, by the way, for the villain, Spencer Tracy, which would have really been interesting. But of course, Marlon had already promised his friend, close friend, Carl Malden, the role. So One-Eyed Jack gets made, over 1 million feet of film of shot. It sits around being edited for about 3 years, ends up at a 141-minute movie, and was the first and last movie Marlon Brando ever directed.
The one line I remember from that film was, "You dirty blood-sucking scum," something like that.
And apparently,
well, that's why you needed Rod Serling, Sam Peckinpah, and Calder Willingham.
Yeah.
So Brando becomes the director. Not the greatest replacement for Stanley Kubrick by far, but apparently Brando did not like the editing room. He found it boring. So here you have a director making a film. He basically dumps it in the editor's lap. No wonder it took 3 years.
Yeah. What do you guys think of Viva Zapata?
Good. I mean, Brando's movies in the 50s were pretty good. I mean, you mentioned Desiree. It's even not considered one of his better films, but there's just something about the 1950s. And I've said this a few times. I have a fondness for films in the 50s because of their efficiency. They really were good stories, and they were told efficiently. There wasn't a lot of self-indulgent crap that seems to invade a lot of contemporary movies. They're just very watchable. And the first movie series I ever watched on television was in 1962. NBC introduced Saturday Night at the Movies, which was a primetime movie show. And their first season, all they did was run 20th Century Fox titles because they got the rights from Fox. So I caught up on all the 1950s movies that Fox produced by watching Saturday Night at the Movies. And one of them was Desiree. One of them was The Young Lions. So yes, definitely.
Okay. That's an interesting story, Stephen, Arthur, and Mike, is that first of all, he goes out to Hollywood, and like the Fred Astaire thing, he can't sing, can't dance. I mean, can't sing, can't act, dances a little. They say his hair is too thin, his nose has got to be fixed, and his acting is fair. Okay, so that's their desire. But finally, he goes out to Hollywood, and he signs a contract with Fox. And he's going to make, believe it or not, The Egyptian. Well, he reads the script and says, I'm not doing it. But he goes out, and like Faulkner, he goes home, except home is New York, as Faulkner went home to Mississippi, and they can't find Brando, and he's quit. He's not doing the movie. This is right before it starts. Well, Zanuck sues him. Fox sues him and makes him. He doesn't want to do Desiree. He doesn't want to do it. And he gets sued for over $1 million, breaking the contract. He has to settle, and he agrees to do 2 movies, Desiree and The Young Lions. So it's an interesting story.
Well, there's one little addition thing. I was reading that Zanuck cast his mistress, Bella Darby, as the lead in The Egyptian. And if you watch The Egyptian, she has an impact on that movie like a giant dead weight whenever she comes on screen.
But Zanuck passed his mistress at the time.
Right.
Zanuck's mistress was half of America. He slept with trees.
But apparently, Brando sat down at the table reading for The Egyptian, and after spending 2 hours listening to Bella Darby in her Czechoslovakian accent play an Egyptian temptress, he excused himself and never came back.
Yeah.
Guys, let's talk about a Marlon Brando movie called Guys and Dolls, one of the greatest shows to ever appear on Broadway. The movie was never that great. It was one of those. You had Sinatra, you had Brando, you had a lot of the guys who were in the Subby K was in the movie. Well, Brando did his own singing. I thought he was great in the movie.
Well, it's that charisma thing. I mean, the way he was dressed, Sky Masterson is like a very charismatic figure. And you give that to Brando, it was a wonderful role for him. That's another example of 1950s, efficiency. They developed that perfectly. It wasn't as great as the stage show, but great music. I'm a big fan of that movie.
Well, you can't get away from Joe Mankiewicz being the director. You can't get away from Kazan being the director of Viva Zapata, On the Waterfront, and Streetcar Named Desire. It's not just the actor, as we all know. I mean, you have great directors who can make a huge difference in a movie. Now, the big problem on Guys and Dolls for Sam Goldwyn and more for Mankiewicz was that Sinatra and Brando couldn't stand each other. They couldn't take each other. Mm-hmm. Sinatra wanted the role of Sky Masterson. He didn't want to play the Sam Levine role.
Nathan Detroit?
Nathan Detroit of a wisecracking Jewish guy. And so they couldn't stand one another and basically had tried to have nothing to do with each other. Also, the irony was that Sinatra had also been hoping to get the role of Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront. That's where the original, they were thinking of him, not Brando. So he lost twice to Brando. So,
but Julian, tell me something. Do they actually sell more Danish than they do cheesecake? What was that? Remember that great bet?
It's
only
Mindy's
instead of Lindy's.
Right. Ziggy's, the same thing.
I read that
arugula or something.
I read that Brando turned down 2 roles of a major of note. He turned down the Lawrence role in Lawrence of Arabia because he didn't want to spend 6 months in a camel in the desert.
Yeah.
And if he was working with David Lean, he would have been more than 6 months on the desert. And but then I wouldn't want to be the camel underneath that man.
And then
I think any time you get anyone in any field who is as good as it can possibly be, and you add the charisma jazz to that person, you see a list of people that fill 2 or 4 handfuls in anything. Again, like I say, Albert Einstein had it, and why didn't now we find out that Oppenheimer had it, I guess, huh?
The other film that he turned down, apparently he was offered the role opposite Paul Newman to play the Sundance Kid in Butch Cassidy. He turned down some really big popular roles that obviously would have generated a lot of energy. And then we come to the 60s, and it's just one bomb after another until, as you point out, R3 gets to The Godfather. I read somewhere that at that point, Brando was poison. Not only because his movies had bombed throughout the decade, but he had gotten involved in some major progressive causes. And at one point, because he was so involved in the civil rights movement, he was marching in Washington, he was taking the lead, that certain southern or southwestern theaters would not play Brando titles. So the exhibition community was starting to turn against him. So between the audience and the exhibition community and the studio executives, he was anathema. So when who's the head of Julian? Who's the head of production at Paramount Godfather time?
Bob Evans?
Bob Evans.
When Bob Evans announces to the people in New York that he wants to cast Marlon Brando to play the Godfather, there was a lot of pushback.
Well, we know the story of how Brando had to make a screen test. They would not accept him. And Coppola goes to his house. It's rather a famous story. At this point, Brando has taken his hair, which was very, very long, and put it kind of in a ponytail, and has taken black shoe polish, and has taken and blackened his hair, putting cotton in his mouth, and does this screen test. And it's the screen test that gets Bluthorn and the Paramount people to okay his playing the role.
But they thought so little of him. What was his salary? I think his salary was like $7,500 or something.
No.
They didn't want to pay him.
I actually saw who's the producer of the film, Julian? I'm forgetting.
Al Ruddy.
Al Ruddy.
I bumped into Al Ruddy at a fundraiser 5 years ago, and because I had heard that the most expensive actor on The Godfather was Richard Castellanos, who had won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, who plays Clemenza, Fat Clemenza. And because nobody else was known at that time, certainly not Pacino, James Caan, and Brando was in the doghouse. But Al Ruddy told me, no, it was favored nations. Everybody got $100,000. So he got $100,000.
I never knew that. And believe me, I thought I didn't know that.
That's straight from the horse's mouth, Al Ruddy.
So Pacino got $100,000?
I think so. Really? I know Caan, De Niro, Caan, Pacino, Brando. I'm not sure if...
Julian, are you aware of that? You believe that?
I believe the fact that they weren't paid big money, Arthur.
Right.
Yeah. I remember something where Brando, I thought, had to put up a bond himself, some sort of money himself, because they were so afraid of his history of going over budget, not showing up, not knowing lines. I mean, and there's a famous shot of, I guess it's Bobby Duvall holding up cue cards on The Godfather with as he reads them. Of course, it's a rather interesting character. But I have a good story. I hope you guys don't know. Ben Hecht wrote a play. This was when Brando was starting out. He did about a half a dozen plays on Broadway. And this was called A Flag is Born. It starred Paul Muni. And Paul Muni is the lead, obviously. And Brando comes in. He's a kind of a passionate guy for the state of Israel. And he's going to believe that it has to be a new country. And he comes in at the end. He has almost no role except at the end, where he gives this incredible impassioned speech. Muni has died at this point, and a flag is over his face. And as Brando is giving the speech, Muni keeps pulling the flag down from his forehead to his nose to his mouth so that the audience can see him. And Brando was so angry at it that he couldn't believe that that's what Muni would do to him on his last speech. Anyhow, the funny.
I'll give you a fast Brando. Well, Brando. We did a lot of business with Paramount in those days, representing the first run theaters in Boston, and I was at Paramount a lot, New York. And got to know briefly a guy named Charlie Bluthorn, who was Gulf and Western, Gulf and Devour, as Mel Brooks would say. Julian, you knew Charlie Bluthorn enough to know that the way he looked, the way he talked, it was a harsh kind of a German accent, And so, but a lot of those guys, in terms of film, were not rocket scientists. Julian, you will agree to that.
100%.
These were not the smartest guys in terms of film, but there was a Frank Blondes and there was Bob Evans. They knew film. There was Peter Bart, who knew, but there was a lot of guys who were surrounding that. They were, as to Coppola, they were all a pain in the ass to him for the whole movie, for Godfather. No one believed in it until it happened. Anyway, so here's Charles Bluthorn. I get to meet him several times. Many years go by, and now I become involved with a movie theater, the Gateway Theater in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, a great little theater, art theater, owned by a gentleman in New York who owned a whole series of real estate properties and the Pioneer grocery store in Columbus Circle. And I meet him. I'm told somebody tells me, I want you to get together with him. It's a perfect combination. You got to meet Charlie. You got to meet this fellow. I won't mention his name. I meet him in a restaurant, and it looks like Charlie Bluthorn and sounds like Charlie Bluthorn. It's unbelievable. How you doing? What is it going? He looks like him. And I say, by any chance, are you related to Charles? I knew him. He stunk. He was a stinker. But it was like working with Charlie. He was my partner in the Gateway Theater. A great guy, a brilliant businessman. But he was the living reincarnation of Charles Bluthorn. And of course, The Godfather was under his aegis. He was there when it happened. And what people didn't seem to understand before it opened was how great this movie was.
Yes.
Never made sense to me. How could you not know?
One of the choices to play the Godfather early on? Ernest Borgnine.
Oh, God.
Well, at least he's Italian. Mike, how about you? Where are you with Brando? Because we're a little older than you are. Tell us, where are you with Brando in your life?
Well, Brando came in fairly early, probably mid to late teens. I started, getting into film and started, of course, with the Godfather films. And he was just amazing in the first one. And then Apocalypse Now. And I think there was a movie I saw him in. I think it was called The Intern or something like that. It was him, Matthew Broderick.
The Freshman.
Freshman.
Yeah.
And, so that's a lot of my experience with him.
Don Juan, did you see him with that with Johnny Depp?
Yes, I did.
And Faye Dunaway.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And of course, you saw him in Superman.
Well, of course, he was Jor-El.
Jor-El.
Yep.
Jor-El.
Daddy. Big Daddy.
Yep, exactly. Big
Apparently,
Daddy.
he was offered both the sequel to Superman and the sequel to Godfather. He was going to offer both those, and he says, when I do a role and I'm done with it, I'm really done with it. So he wouldn't want to do that.
Have you guys, Steve, Julian, Mike, have you ever seen a better screen actor than Marlon Brando?
Well, I would say my favorite screen actor was Spencer Tracy, but I loved Brando, especially in the 50s. But and the Godfather. In fact, I'm one of the few people that I know that likes The Godfather better than Godfather 2 because I miss Brando so. I don't mean to say that Godfather 2 is not a good movie, but oh my God, that presence in Godfather was something. But
how about Last Tango?
Not for me. It would be The Last Tango.
No.
Yeah.
Well,
I thought it was great.
Let's talk a little bit about the actors that followed Brando, who basically, in a way, I don't know if you could say totally mimicked him, but they kind of adopted that smoldering, charismatic style of his, starting with James Dean.
Who worshipped him, who worshipped Brando. They knew each
quite
other.
A subject, you know. What kind of a career would Dean have had? He had that same kind of charisma, and he was a great actor, and he came out of that school of acting. What a career! 24 years old. Holy man!
And 3 for 3. East of Eden, Giant, and Help Me.
Right. Then my favorite actor of all time is Steve McQueen in his heyday.
Oh, come on, Steve.
Steve McQueen.
I love Steve McQueen, but come on, as an actor, he's a movie star.
He's my favorite. I'm not saying he's the greatest actor of all time, but
okay.
for me, as a young kid, seeing Steve McQueen starting with, The Blob, 1958, he was introduced as Stephen McQueen, but between Never So Few, The Great Escape, The Magnificent Seven, Bullet, Towering Inferno, just some of my favorite films of all time. And McQueen had a quality. I don't think he went too far with it, but he is known to have removed script pages over the years with dialogue on it. Dialogue.
He hated dialogue.
Yeah.
He hated dialogue. And the fact of the matter is that he had a huge amount of charisma.
Huge.
But to say it as a great actor, I mean, I would have to debate that. But as a screen presence, yes, he was a movie star, without question.
See, the thing is, it's not only acting talent, it is that charisma and the right role. I mean...
Well, that's right. That's true. Kazan and Brando almost came together again after many years. After they had done, as we mentioned, Streetcar and Viva Zapata and On the Waterfront, they really hadn't worked at all together. Kazan had named names. Brando was wildly upset about that, and they both lived on different coasts. But Kazan wrote a huge #1 best-selling book called The Arrangement that, believe it or not, was on the New York Times bestseller #1 for almost a year.
Wow.
And he decided that he wanted to make that movie because he himself was in a slump. He hadn't had a big success, and he felt Brando was the perfect person for it.
Julian, what is The Arrangement about? What is that story about?
It's basically a triangle, Steve. When we were all growing up, there was a song torn between two lovers. It's almost like that. There's an advertising man who's happily married, but he meets this young girl and falls in love with her. And what Kazan told me that was fascinating, he said that the biggest letters he would get, the most, were not from men who had that problem, but women. He said he had so many letters from women saying they were torn between two lovers, two men. So that was interesting. Anyhow.
Who was in it?
Kirk Douglas, Faye Dunaway.
Yeah.
Kirk Douglas.
I remember the movie.
Yeah. Anyhow, so Kazan goes to Brando. They kind of get together again, and he's really excited. And Kazan writes him a letter saying, look, if you want to do this, and I want to do it with you, you got to stop this. You can't walk through the movie. You've been walking through movies for years. You got to get in and do it the way blah, blah, blah. And really, it's quite an interesting letter. It's public, so you can read it. And Brando agrees to do it. In fact, so much so that they're now hired men to do the hairpiece because he needs a hairpiece for the role. And they've measured him, etc. And he gets a call, Kazan, from Brando saying, will you come see me? And Kazan goes to see him, and he goes up to his home in Beverly Hills, and Kazan's waiting for him in the parking area and says, what is it? What's the matter, Marlon? And he said, well, Martin Luther King has just been shot, and I'm devastated, and I don't want to do your movie. I can't do your movie. Huh. And that was the end of that. Kazan, I don't think they ever spoke again. Kazan was really upset with it. Understood that he understood why Brando was upset, of course, but not to the point that he was reneging.
But I do recall seeing the movie many years ago. It was not a great movie, as I recall.
No, it was not a great movie. No. And Kirk Douglas was miscast. But Kazan wanted to make the movie, and he had meetings with Kirk Douglas, and Douglas really wanted to do it. Kazan wanted his wife, Barbara Loden, to play the role with Brando. That was his original cast. And Barbara didn't have a name at all. She had been in the movie A Splendor in the Grass with Natalie Wood and Warren Beatty.
How do you all feel about the movie Mutiny on the Bounty with Brando?
Well, they had enormous problems on that, but that was another case where the director was replaced. I know that Louis Milestone ended up directing it, but I think he replaced another director. Was it Kubrick again, Julian? I can't remember.
I don't think it was Kubrick, Steve, but I think you're right that it wasn't. But they went so over budget, and I think that's how he fell in love with Tahiti. I think that's what his whole thing happened with Tahiti. He was a man who had a terrible childhood. His mother was an alcoholic, and his father was a traveling salesman who ostensibly beat her at times. It was not a great beginning in his life. He ended up hiring his father at the end of his father's life, who worked, they kind of switched roles, and his mother died sadly. But she was supposed to be a very beautiful woman, and a lot of people found her incredibly charming. And it's interesting that he ended up having his father work for him.
One of his closest friends became Sammy Davis. Sammy Davis Jr. Was very close to Brando, and there you have. You want to talk about charisma? Oh my God!
Well, I was thinking about contemporary actors that have a Brando quality. I'm thinking of the word brooding, and it seems to apply a lot to Phoenix, Joaquin Phoenix.
Phoenix. Yes, and I think Sean Penn as well.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. These are actors who are very well trained, have a little eccentricity, but
you talked about some of the actors who came out of Godfather, and didn't mention De Niro, of all people, of course, who has had a more incredible career than De Niro. He has really, done so many movies. And talk about mumbling. He's been known for mumbling, but very slow. But he's done some great films. He has done some.
I finally watched Killers of the Flower Moon, which is 3 hours and 20 minutes.
What do you think?
I thought it could have been 2 hours. The story of, and this is a quick tangent, but the story of Killers of the Flower Moon, which is about these Native Americans who are being systematically murdered for their oil rights back in the early parts of the 1920s, was told in a Jimmy Stewart film in 1959 called The FBI Story.
Right.
It was one of 4 segments. They did the whole story in 25 minutes. I got news for you. For my money, that 25 minutes in that FBI story was more entertaining than 3 hours and 20 minutes. Scorsese is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. but I think he was indulged a little too much on this film. I'm sorry.
Julian and I share a similar problem, if you will, with regard to film or other things. I don't think either one of us will ever see a Killing of the Flowers Moon, because it deals with man's inhumanity to man, and I, for one, can't handle it. Apparently, Julian can't either. But I've never seen Schindler's List because of that. I can't take just dealing with it. It'd be a tough run through it. Was it tough for you to sit through the whole thing?
Oh, I couldn't do it in one night. I had to do it in 2 nights. It's like Scorsese's Gangs of New York. That took 4 nights. It's sorry, Martin. I love your films, but this is.
How about The Irishman?
The Irishman, I thought, was just okay. I felt I'd seen
again, a little bit long and okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, every film now.
I like that film a lot. I disagree on that one.
Irishman?
But I want to talk about Brando, because I have a story that I was fascinated, maybe not fascinated, but interested in. And that was the fact that when Joe Mankiewicz wanted to hire him to play in Julius Caesar, Mark Anthony, the studio people, based on what you guys have said, felt the guy mumbles. How is he going to do Shakespeare? Yeah, doesn't have any background in Shakespeare. So Mankiewicz goes to Brando and he says, I want you to memorize Friends, Roman Countrymen, the famous speech that Mark Anthony gives, and then record it and give me a tape of it. And Brando does that, and he goes to a meeting, Mankiewicz, with the tape, plays it, and said, Who is that? Who do you think is talking and giving this speech? And they say, oh, it's Olivier, no, it's Gielgud, Ralph Richardson. They're going on, and he says it's Marlon Brando. And that's supposedly how that he got hired. So that's kind of interesting. And he was really good in that movie, by the way, in my opinion.
He was great. He was great in the movie. And again, his presence, just looking at the guy. The guy was incredible to look at. You ever hear Rita Moreno tell her first time she gazed at him, my God, I looked at this man. And he was very ambitious sexually. He was all over the place, as you could only imagine, particularly being in theater and all, in film. But he had a whole bunch of lovers, and he was special as an actor, special for the extra jazz he brought to in this just looking at the guy on the screen. Because again, when I saw him at 10 years old, I saw him in The Men. I should not have known that something special was happening up on the screen, but I looked at it, God, this guy's great. And he was in a wheelchair.
We should.
A movie, by the way, if you've not seen, you should see The Men.
Yeah, we should point out that he's a paraplegic, as you were saying.
Yes.
And it was his first movie, and it was Stanley Kramer of many movies that Stanley Kramer made that hired him first. But we should also mention that he was a very undisciplined man in his life, in his acting. He was a guy who loved motorcycles. He loved playing bongo drums.
And in his eating.
And he's,
by the way, speaking of motorcycles, we haven't really talked much about the Wild One. And those images of him with those sunglasses and that cap and driving on the motorcycle, talk about the iconic image of the 1950s, counterculture. You know, our image, by the way, typically of motorcycle gangs is guys with big, thick beards who are usually overweight, and they cuss a lot, and they ride motorcycles. Marlon Brando was probably the most charismatic gang leader I've ever seen in anything.
With the hat. Gil Stratton Jr., right?
and Lee Marvin.
Lee Marvin, yes.
Yeah.
No, definitely.
I always say, Steve, Lee Marvin, Charles Bronson schlepped in movies in one way or another for 20 years before they became stars.
It's true.
But they were always working, you know.
Julian, when I said earlier, I mentioned Irwin Shaw and the Young Lions, you said you had a story.
Irwin Shaw came on my radio show, and he was drunk. He was so drunk that I was so afraid to put him on, and I was live on the air. But I said, oh, the hell with it. I love the Young Lions, and I'm going to just take a shot. And he's, just sit over here. I'll go over here. I'll sit there. I said, okay, just sit wherever you want to sit. So we sat, and I said, Irwin Shaw, how do you do? He says, I'm fine. And I think, whoa, what's going on? This is like a totally different man on the air. I'll be going to a commercial. Hey, I'm doing okay, right, kid? I'm doing fine. I said, oh, you're doing great. You're doing great. So that was my Irwin Shaw story.
When I went to Klosters, which is that little town in Switzerland where he lived, I sit down at the luncheon table, and the very first question he says when he looks at me, before he says hello, he says, "Who broke your nose?" Because I had a bump on my nose because I had fallen against a railroad track when I was 12. And it turns out that he was hoping I had gotten into a fight at some army base, which would have emulated what happened to him in the war.
Yeah,
he was beaten up considerably, and obviously the Montgomery Clift character in The Young Lions is his character. But
the Brando mumbling thing, which was later caught on by De Niro, same school of acting. The great story, I may have mentioned this, I don't know, but there's a piece of video on YouTube of the shooting Casino, and Rickles they empty the hotel at about 3:00 in the morning. They shoot the scene where the casino head, Don Rickles, is walking, the manager is walking down this hallway with De Niro, who's the gangster. And so, Rickles, who's not really an actor, but who he did in fact go to a drama school, says his line, what do you think, boss? And all of a sudden he looks at De Niro, he says, what? Well, they had a cut. Finally, they get together in a room, and they're sitting there, and here's the piece of video which you can see. And then Rickles says to him, why do you keep mumbling? Can't you just say the line? Read the card, for Christ's sake. Let's get out of it. He does it in his inimitable way. It's a very funny little moment, which you'll see on YouTube. But De Niro was a mumbler. And maybe that's the secret to becoming a big star. Brando mumbling and De Niro mumbling. But anyway, that's the mumble story.
Of course, that thing about Brando mumbling, I mean, I've seen a lot of his movies. He's not mumbling. He just isn't. I mean, I think he had that reputation from theater where he would turn his back to the audience and talk to the back of the theater. But I don't think in movies, I mean, as you said.
The Godfather, Julian, a lot of it is because of the things in his cheeks came out like that, So,
yeah, it's true, but I could hear him. I could understand.
Yeah, he enunciates pretty well. I call it the Colonel Kurtz syndrome. That is the ultimate mumbling part, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I must
Brando, say, what a person to be offered in a cast in almost anything. And of course, I wish he had done better films in his latter years, but it happens. But we always have Brando. We'll always have Guys and Dolls. We'll always have The Godfather. The nice thing about movie actors is that they're always with us. I just watched The Young Lions again recently, and it's been, my God, it's 66 years later.
Who was the girl in that movie? Was that My Brit?
My Brit,
yes.
Hope Lang,
Yep.
and Barbara Rush were the three female leads. Well, we've come to the end of our show. We would like to reach out once again to the people who are listening. If you love our show, as we hope you do, please subscribe. We love having subscribers, and please communicate with us if you'd like. If you have any ideas for the show, if you have guests you'd like to recommend, contact us at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. I'll say it twice because sometimes people don't hear it the first time. talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. We're also on YouTube now. You can find us by just Googling Tales from Hollywoodland and YouTube. And next week, can I talk about our next show? I think we're excited. We're going to be talking about silent films. And Julian, tell us who our guest is.
Lee DeSantis is our guest, and it's not just silent films, also early talkies. We'll do both because we have to get from one to the other. And as we all know, silent films were not silent. There was sometimes sound effects, and there always was music.
And I remember those piano players exactly right in the theater.
What was that theater on Fairfax Avenue that was your silent films?
Yes, there's a little revival house there.
Still there?
Silence. Yeah, it's still there. Absolutely.
Some of the great films, we'll talk about them, but there's some great movies that stand up today, even without the dialogue.
Exactly. Just show me Buster Keaton and the General, and we're going to town with it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Steve. Here's to Clara Bow.
The Epsilon 3 is a dream given form. It's a home away from home for three guys to watch a 90s sci-fi classic TV show. Three guys with microphones over 3,249 miles apart, all alone in the night.
The year is 2262. The place, Babylon 5. The podcast, The Epsilon 3.
On the ESO Network.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.